Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. I've been gone for a little while. I've been super busy at work. Not all of it good. Great things going on for me, great things going on for my students, but some stuff around me that has just kept me very busy. And then we had some family in town last weekend. We had a little family celebration going on. So plenty of things to keep me rambling, if you will. But I did want to get back this week with a shelf tour. And in this case, of course, we organize our shelves by publisher, go after one of the big guns, one of the big publishers, some publisher that a lot of people are probably familiar with, even if you haven't necessarily purchased any of their volumes, in part because they're often very just pricey. And that would be the Great Library of America. I have a number of shelves up here, but I also have a whole stack of Library of America publications that are by African-American writers, and they're fabulous. These are these collect some of the great writers, American writers from the US, American writers, but African-American writers specifically. And the Library of America, of course, has the great cloth-bound volumes, the name on the spine, the little flyleaf. They're very durable. The paper's excellent quality, like it doesn't decay and turn yellowish with acid over time. Usually Library of America volumes are anthologies to a certain extent. They'll collect multiple works from a writer, in some cases multiple works of fiction, in other multiple cases of nonfiction. And there's usually some notes. There might be a quick biographical introduction, but there's not a huge amount of critical apparatus. It's not what you find, say, in Penguin Classics or Oxford World Classics, where there's a huge amount of annotation about everything that's going on. But these editions are fantastic, and they collect some writers that are just absolutely, in my opinion, essential for readers. Now, a quick note on the color of spines. Unlike Everman's Library, which I discussed in that video, all of these, by the way, are linked in a playlist called Shelf Tours or Library Tours. Unlike the Everman's Library, unlike the Penguin Classics little color bars, there's not a color code to the Library of America. There's no reason that Zora Neale Hurston's nonfiction and folklore is in green, and Richard Wright's is in the maroon burgundy color. They have four general colors: this dark green, maroon burgundy, which we'll see later, a dark blue, and then sort of a sand gold color. There's no code to them. All they do, Library of America, when they go to publish a new writer to their collection, they look and see alphabetically who's before and after that writer, and what two colors are those, pick an alternate color. That's it. Periodically, they check to see with the estate if there's some special color that the author might have wanted. I think for one of their anthologies on nature or writing around the environment, they intentionally chose green, something like that. But generally, it's just what's one of the two colors that haven't been used alphabetically. That's all. But I digress. Let's get into these books because these are fantastic books. First up, I have the African American Poetry Anthology, 250 Years of Struggle and Song. This was edited by Kevin Young. It is amazing. I cannot recommend this volume highly enough. I only acquired it just very recently, the past 2 months, and I've really enjoyed getting into it. It really is 250 years of poetry, starting with Phillis Wheatley in 1770 and running all the way up to, let's see, who's the most recent? Philip B. Williams, writers in Jamila Woods, Ode to Herb Kent. So writers from just a couple of years ago, poets from just a couple of years ago. And that makes it great, in part because it's one of the few Library of America volumes that really does keep up to pace with current U.S. writing. It's not just classics from authors generally who have passed away or from 200 years ago. This is an anthology that is very much up to date, and it collects some absolutely fabulous poets, a huge number of whom I had never even heard of, and I enjoy reading poetry. So this is a great volume, great keeper. Next up, the Slave Narratives volume, possibly a top 5 Library of America volume in my reading. This collects a huge number of narratives. So we have James Albert Ukasa Groniosa. We have the famous Olada Equiano, an interesting narrative. What a title. Nat Turner's Confession. There's some historical question about how much of that is actually Nat Turner's confession, and the fact that it was taken down by whites who captured Nat Turner. Read that with sort of that in mind when you encounter that narrative. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which I have a video on, I'll link that in the description box. William Wells Brown, also critical. Henry Bibbs, Sojourner Truth, that's a powerful one. William and Ellen Craft, I read that last year. That is one of the most interesting in terms of how they managed to, as a husband and wife, how they worked together to escape, and really the level to which they were able to play on the racist assumptions of the slaveholders in the South. Harriet Jacobs, that's a critical narrative. That's the only one in my reading that is up there with Frederick Douglass in terms of like the one that everybody in the U.S. and really globally should be aware of. And then Jacob D. Green's, which again is, I almost feel like that's the type of narrative that was a big influence on a writer like Zora Neale Hurston. But this is a great volume. Then I have the Reporting Civil Rights, parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is running from roughly 1940 in efforts to desegregate the military before World War II started, and then runs up to 1963, and right around the March on Washington. It's one of the, again, up there with the slave narrative in terms of this volume in particular, I think is incredibly strong in terms of the nonfiction that the Library of America has published. Reporting Civil Rights Part 2 runs then another 10 years, 1963 to 1973. This then encompasses the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the assassinations of Malcolm X and then Martin Luther King Jr., and then moving into the writings from the Black Power movement, and really showing the sort of a final shift in the aftermath of those large works of legislation, but the horrifying murder of Martin Luther King and the ways in which that changed the civil rights movement irrevocably. Great volume as well. Now, in terms of fiction, there's some great stuff. I have the Harlem Renaissance box set, which has some outstanding artwork. Love this one. And so these are broken up into 2 sections, 4 novels of the 1920s. And again, I'll try to show the covers because they're just really inspired. Okay. So 5 novels of the 1920s. There's some great ones in here. Cain, by Jean Toomer. It's a modernist masterpiece. It's unlike almost any book you'll ever read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. I've done a video, and I believe Codex Cantina has done one on one of the stories that make up Cain. It's incredible. Claude McKay's Home to Harlem. That's a great book. Claude McKay's Romance to Marseille was just recently published, I want to say in 2020, by Penguin Classics. That's amazing as well. Nella Larson's Quicksand. Nella Larson, of course, is probably most famous for Passing. Quicksand, I think, is a more autobiographical novel in some ways. Jesse Redmond Fawcett's Plum Bun, I haven't read that. I'm really looking forward to. And then the incredible The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman. Just great books. Then there's the Harlem Renaissance, 4 novels of the 1930s. Again, just a wonderful artwork, kind of unusual and cool. Langston Hughes' Not Without Laughter. George S. Schuyler's Black No More. That is it's a satire. And it's a satire that I think has been misrepresented and misappropriated by people who are racist over the years, because it's a satire that really does probe and cut about as deep as satire can. And Schuyler he's certainly questioning perceived authority within the Harlem Renaissance community, within what was at the time a burgeoning civil rights movement. Marcus Garvey is satire. The Pan-African movement is a target of the satire. And so because of that, people would sort of cherry pick what they wanted to attack in a very demeaning way different African-American leaders. Rudolph Fisher's The Conjure Man Dies. I'm really planning to try and read that this March. I think it was republished last year by Harper. And then Arna Bontemps' Black Thunder. Arna Bontemps is great. Is frequently anthologized, I believe, with poetry as well. So that was the Harlem Renaissance novels. And then another figure sort of within the Harlem Renaissance, but very much of her own tack, would be the great Zora Neale Hurston. So there are 2 volumes. I only have the nonfiction one, but there is a volume that collects her novels. And those, of course, are amazing. I don't have that volume, but I will hope to acquire that someday. This one, though, has her sort of autoethnography where she's going back home to Florida. So Mules and Men, wonderful. Tell My Horse, Dust Tracks on a Road, which is her own actual like autobiography memoir, and then a number of essays and articles she had published. And some of those are really fantastic. One that is really important, and one that I would highly recommend folks to read is, what is it? What White Publishers Won't Print. It's like a 6-page article, and it is a critical essay in exploring the ways in which writers like Hurston and others were going to challenge and knowingly challenging the not only segregation, but the ways in which publishing platforms and, not just books, but articles and all sorts of works, what could be published and where it could be published, where audiences would have access to it, and how they were going to push against that. Richard Wright. I have a couple of volumes from Richard Wright. Richard Wright is a very incredible writer. I did a couple of videos on his native son. So this collects his early works, Laud Today, and then Uncle Tom's Children. And Uncle Tom's Children is a set of stories. Laud Today is super unconventional, modernist type work. And Wright is a naturalist. He's always interested in sort of exploring how does society or an environment create almost sort of this fatalistic aspect to a character's life, to a person's life, in the vein of the great French naturalists like Émile Zola, or even writers like Stephen Crane in the US. And so Laud Today, it feels much more experimental, much very divergent from Wright's other works. Uncle Tom's Children is a set of short stories, and then Native Son, which is a true masterpiece, a book that, again, I just feel like deserves, it's often highly regarded, it deserves an even wider audience, a global audience. And that's a naturalist work, but an incredibly powerful work. I then also have the second volume, which has his later works. And that has my personal favorite from Richard Wright, which is Black Boy. This is the unexpurgated edition, which includes what it was called like the American Hunger section. And then The Outsider, which is an interesting work. Again, I think it feels a little bit closer in terms of style and how Wright is trying to experiment to Laud Today than Native Son and the sense of protest and injustice that Native Son is demanding. That, Wright's demanding of his characters within the book, and that he's really demanding of his readers, what they consider. Recently, The Man Who Lived Underground was published by the Library of America, and I have not yet read this one. I just acquired it 2 months ago in the Barnes & Noble sale, so I'm hoping to get to that maybe at the end of this month, but certainly this sometime this year, because Wright's a writer that I love spending time with. Wright was an enormous influence and sort of a counter-revolutionary influence on the great James Baldwin. Notes of a Native Son directly references the great Native Son from Wright. It is a fabulous collection of essays. I did a video on it just last month. I'll link that in the description box. But this volume collects Baldwin's nonfiction, his essays. So Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, which is subtitled More Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin's explorations of art, of representations, Black representations within art, in literature, in film, and then his own autobiography, and some of his own ideas around art and really the intersection of art and the civil rights movement and society, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. The Fire Next Time, which is an incredible book that is absolutely passionate. It captures that same sense of protest and fire that Richard Wright has in Native Son, that Gene Toomer has in many of his stories from Kane, that writers within the slave narratives were sharing, and he just lets it all out on the page in The Fire Next Time. No Name in the Street, The Devil Finds Work, which is a later collection, and then a whole series of other essays, including The Price of the Ticket. Almost, I want to say, everything in this book was recently recollected and republished as The Price of the Ticket, a big, thick volumes. So if you get that, you've basically got everything in here, but please spend some time reading James Baldwin. His early novels, Baldwin's early novels and stories. So this one has Go Tell It on the Mountain. Great autobiographical work dealing with sort of his growing up. Baldwin was a preacher as an adolescent. His father had been a preacher, and they had a strained relationship. Baldwin discusses that in Notes of a Native Son and Nobody Knows My Name, and really throughout his writings. Giovanni's Room, which is really, I think, the audience for Giovanni's Room has really exploded in my perception over the past maybe 5-6 years, because of the ways in which Baldwin explicitly starts to introduce questions around, how if he's protesting the racism of a society, he's also going to protest the homophobia of a society. And then Another Country, which is much longer, much more developed, Going to Meet the Man, and then which has some of his early stories. So great volume as well. And then we have Baldwin's later novels, including the wonderful If Beale Street Could Talk. This has Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, If Beale Street Could Talk, and Just Above My Head. This is another one I just acquired a couple months ago, so I'm excited to dive in on this one as well, beyond just If Beale Street Could Talk. And then finally, the last volume I have is the Octavia Butler. And this is, I believe, the first of what's going to be multiple volumes that the Library of America will publish from the great Octavia Butler. These are science fiction novels, sort of horror novels. Kindred it's astonishing what Kindred accomplishes as a book that's purportedly science fiction, but is much, much more demanding than that. The way in which Butler is really showing a character who's fully actualized and deeply conscious of her own intelligence, her own self-worth, her own value, and the ways in which that character, Dana, has to experience the horrors of slavery, having read about them, being aware of them, and then to experience them. It creates something that I think comes as close as possible to those slave narratives, where it was an actual lived-in horror that they experienced. Butler is, in terms of fiction, cutting about as close as those narratives can. And so Kindred's amazing. Fledgling's really interesting. I think a lot of people, I think that's probably Butler's least appreciated work. There's some real strength there to it. I'm currently rereading Kindred, and I'm hoping to put that out maybe this weekend. But it's a great book. And then this novel, it says collected stories, but it also has a number of her early essays, like essays from the 1970s that she wrote. And in terms of the stories, probably the most Crossover is probably the most famous of her stories. I think that's the one I hear discussed. But within the essays, Lost Races of Science Fiction is amazing. And again, just if you I don't know if there's if that's available online. I'll look to see, and I might put a link in if I can find it. But this is a great volume as well. Now, there are other writers, African-American writers, that the Library of America has published. I'm 99% sure that there's a Frederick Douglass volume. I know that they have a Charles W. Chestnut volume. I just happen to have the Viking Portable Charles W. Chestnut. So I don't have the Library of America one. And I know there's a James Weldon Johnson volume. And that's great. That will have Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. I believe it has God's Trombones, which is a real masterpiece. And then I'm not sure what else is in that one, but I believe there's a James Weldon Johnson volume. And there are others. I know there's the Zora Neale Hurston novels, but I'm sure there are others. And, let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you have any of these. Highly recommend all of these. So, again, I hope everybody's doing well. Have a great week. Thanks.